Hello again. In this video, I'm going to take a deeper look at the Kessel Run Draft-A-Thon results, mainly because there were three strong contenders and I'd like to see how they differentiate from each other. Hopefully, you're just as interested. I did notice that when I presented this slide in the other video, that there were errors. It looks like I had published a working copy of that slide instead of the finalized one. I apologize for my error. Although there were changes, they were cosmetic and the underlying results of that video remain intact. Steve Laidlaw won the title, DatsyukToZetterberg and Robert Koho were the other strong challengers. To use a poker term, these were the Manhattans of the top guides. With a few exceptions, they basically stayed at the top throughout all of the testing. And in this slide, I have isolated those three guides. I changed the color scheme for future slides in this video, but the data is still the same. This is where I start to dig and experiment. I placed each guide alone against the same opponents from the different tiers. You might ask why. I wanted to see the effectiveness of Steve Laidlaw, DatsyukToZetterberg, and Robert Koho's lists independently, without any influence from the other two strong challengers. The graphs to the left represent the number of wins against the different tiers at the various draft lengths. The tables to the right show what percentage of victory they earned and what place they came in as compared to the guides in those tiers. DatsyukToZetterberg came in first place through tiers 2 to 6, but fell to 4th against the top tier. They clearly dominated the weakest tier by earning 94 and 83% of all the possible victories. Those percentages did fall between 26 and 43, but were still strong showings to keep the first place ranking against tiers 4, 3, and 2. However, against the top tier, they only did well in the 10, 15, and 30 round drafts. They were vulnerable in those middle length drafts. Robert Koho was a different story. Their 10 round drafts were the weakest of the three, but they were able to make up for the poor starts except when it came to the top tier. Alone, they had no chance in that grouping and only managed to take 4th place. The key note is that their performance was more consistent, never dipping below 40% until that top tier. The results almost looked like DatsyukToZetterberg's, but Steve Laidlaw's tables expose an even bigger vulnerability during the mid-length drafts. They were able to use a good start and a great finish to win most of the time, as long as those mid-range drafts produced decent results. So how did they avoid staying in Tier 5? They were never that low. From the first battle round's results, they slotted in the 3rd tier and never looked down. Even if they did, that specific combination of guides in Tier 5 would have changed, and then they would have been able to climb out and upwards. A weakness is visible, though. Next, in this slide, which looks like a bunch of X-ray or MRI results, has the three guides fight against each other and the opponents of the tiers. Starting from Tier 6 and moving up in the image, Steve, Datsyuk, and Robert dominated the field. The other guides had no room to breathe or get a foothold. That starts changing in Tier 4, but is more visible in Tier 3. By the time they get up into the top tier, the other 5 guides were able to carve out a significant number of wins through the mid-length drafts, but they were less effective in the 10, 30, and max round drafts. That is why Steve Laidlaw was able to claim the title, DatsyukToZetterberg 2nd place, and Robert Koho 4th. It may sound odd, but Steve Laidlaw was boosted by the win splitting that stronger tiers provided. If not for that, they would have been dominated by Robert Koho and DatsyukToZetterberg. This is where Robert Koho did best. Again, the starts were almost invisible. Otherwise, there were a lot of drafts where they were the best. Lastly, DatsyukToZetterberg had strong showings in many more drafts through all the tiers. But when faced with the best of the best, they were edged out by Steve Laidlaw. The other guides were able to erode enough wins away from Datsyuk and in those mid-range drafts to make a difference. I now show this slide of when DatsyukToZetterberg, Robert Koho, and Steve Laidlaw were paired in twos against the same tier opponents. It is busy, but I will explain what is shown. From the smaller pie charts on the right-hand side, These are the battles within each tier when two of our contenders were fighting each other and the other 6 guides. The slightly larger pie chart is the summation of those battles. As an example from Tier 6, it didn't matter which pair went up against the other guides. Practically all the wins went to one of the 2 top contending guides. Even so, we can clearly see that Steve Laidlaw earned fewer wins. Robert Koho fought hard and won a healthy chunk, but DatsyukToZetterberg had a significant bit more. It was the dominant guide under those conditions. As we look through the tiers, we start to see that the other guides established themselves and gradually earned more and more wins. Those victories are usually pronounced in the middle-length drafts, as we saw in past slides. When we examine Tier 5, DatsyukToZetterberg remained the dominant list even though they have slightly fewer total wins. Robert Koho stayed at about the same level. Steve Laidlaw dropped significantly, basically giving away to the other guides. In Tier 4, it was Robert Koho who controlled things. DatsyukToZetterberg lost 40% of their wins, and it looks like Steve Laidlaw was the victorious recipient of those drafts. Tier 3 saw Steve Laidlaw establish themselves on top of the hill, with Robert Koho keeping second. DatsyukToZetterberg's fall deepened. But a lot of that was recovered by DatsyukToZetterberg in the second tier. They handled their battles with Robert Koho and Steve Laidlaw in about the same level. Robert Koho held more of their ground against the other guides, unlike Steve Laidlaw. Then, against the top tier, DatsyukToZetterberg gave back all the gains, but still outdid Steve Laidlaw and Robert Koho. But it was their battles specifically against Steve Laidlaw where they retained most of their ground. If you add up all of the small pie chart colored regions together, you get the outcome on the left-hand side. Here you see that DatsyukToZetterberg had more success than the other 2. Robert Koho was on his heels, and Steve Laidlaw had certain ranges where they performed better, but on the whole, they were not as dominant as the other 2. Conclusions? Steve Laidlaw is the Draft-A-Thon champion, but there was some good timing going into the Kessel Run's final battle. Hey, that's how competitions go. Fortune was on his side. Overall, DatsyukToZetterberg has the edge, simply because he starts out better than the other 2. Going head-to-head, in pairs, or purely on his own, their 10 and 15 round drafts give him a huge jump. Robert Koho has moments where he leads the pack, but ultimately bows down to DatsyukToZetterberg. The most glaring outcome was when Robert Koho goes up against the other tier opponents by himself, and he doesn't win more than 40% of the 10 round drafts. At a minimum, that is what Steve Laidlaw did. This was the first time we saw a very competitive 3-way fight for the title, and I hope you found it interesting to see where the wins generated for those guides. We'll have more testing to report on in our next video. See you soon.